So today we wrap up this short 4-part Advent sermon series called Christmas Under Wraps. And again, some themes we're using from Tim Keller's wonderful devotional book called Hidden Christmas. And I may use it again next year because I only made it through halfway, so there's still a lot left. We may do like volume 2 next year of Christmas Under Wraps. Today we're going to tie a bow on it, if you will, with a message about choosing your king. An invitation to choose your king. And to do so, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 2, parts of the Christmas story we're all probably relatively familiar with, unpacking that, and then truly comparing two kings. We're going to see two kings that are mentioned in the story of Jesus' birth, and what we're left with, I would argue, is that we get to choose a king. So let's go right to it, Matthew chapter 2. And I'll be bouncing around the passages, the verses are on the screen, bouncing around to sort of hit the highlights of what I want to focus on today. Starting in verse 1. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, "Go, search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother, escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you. For Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. He gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. But when he, Joseph, heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So every good story has a conflict. And the conflict in this story becomes apparent very, very, very quickly, and it comes to us in the form of a question. The Magi from the east arrive, and they simply ask, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews?" So legendary NFL coach John Madden, and I would argue even more legendary NFL game commentator John Madden, he's credited with what has become a common thought and a common statement within NFL circles these days. John Madden said this: "If you have two quarterbacks, you actually have none." Now, on the surface, this doesn't make sense. The math doesn't check out. What do you mean, John? I don't have 0 quarterbacks. I have 2 quarterbacks, just like you said, right? It doesn't actually make sense. Now, I want to pause for just a moment and say, as a Cleveland Browns fan, I'm tired of having way more than 2 quarterbacks and still having 0. If you haven't seen the famous jersey recently, we're now up to 42 starting quarterbacks in the last 25 years. And, Browns fans, if you weren't aware of this, could I depress you a little more this morning? Great, I will. Did you know that just this season, we have actually, because of the way contract guarantees work, we have been paying 8 people to play quarterback for us, several of whom are not on the team anymore. We're doing great. We're doing really great. But John Madden, he says if you have 2 quarterbacks, you actually have none. He's trying to cleverly say you can't share the quarterback position. You can't have 2 leaders for the offense. because those other 10 guys need to develop around the way a singular quarterback leads the huddle, changes the play at the line, calls the cadence, executes the play, throws the ball. You need consistency for efficiency. And if it's true in the NFL that having two leaders of an offense is problematic, it's really problematic, the idea of having two political leaders in a tense region where they're balancing their ancient independent identity with the reality of the occupational rule of the Roman Empire. Can you feel the tension mounting in the room as the Magi from the east arrive? They go into the presence of Herod and they say, "Hey, can you show us the way to the king?" Pro tip, you don't ask the current king of the Jews to help you find the new king of the Jews. Herod had been appointed king of Judea back in the late 30s BC. He'd been doing this for a while. And the idea of him being removed and displaced as the king was problematic. No wonder he was disturbed, as it said in the text. And I would argue that word is a good starting point for the overall personality and core values of Herod, which we're now going to explore. So we're going to look at this first king, Herod. Who was he? What did he do? What were his core values, right? And what do we learn from the Christmas story right here in front of us? Well, first of all, we learned that Herod used other people for his own selfish purposes. It said in the text that Herod called the Magi in secretly. First of all, when you call people in secretly, it's probably not for a very good thing, unless it's a surprise party. Those are wonderful. But other than that, if it's secrecy, it's probably not good. And he called them in and said, "Hey, I want to know the exact time that the star." Do you think Herod had any care or concern for the Magi? Zero. He's using them for his own selfish purposes. And then beyond that, he blatantly lies about his intentions. Lies. Because what does he say to them? Go and search. Do it diligently. And as soon as you find that baby, let me know, because then I will what? I'm going to come worship right alongside of you. Not true. And I know that some of you are like, what? What strangeness to my ears, the idea of a political figure blatantly lying to influence people to do what he wants. I'm glad we have no more documented evidence of that in the last 200 years or 2,000 years ever at all. Whew! Yeah, listen, I've only been politically attuned for the last 25 or 30 years, and I'm ready to wave the white flag and be like, I'm done, I'm out. I've seen enough deception and half-truth and blatant lies that I'm just ready to be done. Of course we're not surprised. Of course we're not surprised that he lies about his intentions here. He also allows and then lives from furious rage. The Greek word that gets translated as furious, thymoo, appears once here in the New Testament, only this spot. It means an intense anger, furiously angry. This is not being mildly irritated at something that's not going your way. No, the word suggests that his entire being was involved because he was so furiously angry. It's not a momentary flash of a temper. We all have issues. We have a momentary, moment of anger that we usually recover from. This is not that. Much, much deeper. He wasn't just annoyed that he'd been deceived by the Magi. He experienced what we can call a consuming rage. And then he acted from that rage to do something absolutely unspeakable. Because, again, with Herod, he was willing to do anything to eliminate threats and retain his power. We call it today the massacre of the innocents, what happened when Herod gave the order. He sent people to Bethlehem and he said, any boy 2 years old or younger, and you know what? Even in the vicinity of Bethlehem, you're to execute them. Tim Keller in his devotional says, from what we know about the population of villages like Bethlehem at the time, this would have been about 20 or 30 children. And while we find this shocking, such atrocities were so commonplace in Herod's reign that it didn't even merit any other historical mention. In other words, outside the Bible, nobody talked about this because it was so low on the meter of bad things that Herod did. What do we learn from Herod about history beyond what we have here just in this little tiny story. I mean, you could do your own search and you'll find some of the very similar things that I found, but I want us to just look at the other things that Herod did, the ways that he operated, his core values to get an idea of who he was. And I'm going to tell you up front, it is not pretty at all. First of all, Herod treated relationships and people as disposable tokens to be discarded when they were no longer valuable to him. Excuse me. Disposable tokens to be discarded when they're no longer valuable. So he was elevated to the king of Judea. He promptly married a Jewish woman named Miriam. And this woman named Miriam was a granddaughter of the former Jewish high priest and king from the previous regime that Herod was replacing. Now, his obsessive love for her is well documented in history. But this is clearly an attempt to secure his claim on the throne and to win favor with the Jewish people because he was not Jewish in the sense. So by marrying into it, he's making an arrangement. One problem, Herod already had a wife, a woman named Doris. And with Doris, Herod had a young son. No worries, Herod simply banished them and sent them away because they were no longer valuable to him. Also, early in his kingship, one of the first things he did, he brought in all of the existing Jewish priests, the men who were in the temple complex doing all the stuff of the temple, and he dismissed every single one of them, and then he sent for families far away from Jerusalem, brought new people in to do all of the priestly stuff that needed to be done at the temple. Why would he do that? Well, it's really simple. He's building a circle of people around him that he knows will be loyal to him no matter what. Relationships don't matter. People don't matter. And they'll be thrown away as soon as their usefulness as a token is gone. Herod also saw threats like everywhere. So he's the first ruler in what we now call the Herodian dynasty because he's the one that started it. But because he was the first ruler, he was constantly paranoid that the previous regime, the Hasmonean dynasty, was going to get enough momentum that they'd be able to come at him and push him out of his throne. He was constantly paranoid of this, to the point that he even eventually saw his own wife, Miriam, as a threat because other members of the family came to him with lies and false accusations, but he believed them in his paranoia. So what did he do? He had his own wife tried and found guilty of adultery, which was not true, and attempting to murder him with poison, also not true, and then he promptly had her executed, killing his own wife. Herod was also far more concerned with as many colossal building projects than he was with actually ruling the people wisely. This is one of the most famous things in all of his reign that he was very, very famous for was all of these building projects, one of them being the Jewish temple, for which people in Jerusalem were ecstatic over. Right? This began about 20 years before the birth of Jesus. Herod rebuilt or enhanced all the existing structures, but wait, there's more. He expanded the footprint to double its original size. It's believed by the time the work was done that this became, at that moment, the largest religious sanctuary potentially on the planet. It was massive. It was hugely impressive. But that's not all. He built at least 5 fortresses, 5 huge fortresses that we're aware of. Why would you build a fortress, let alone many of them? It's simple. Because if a revolution starts to brew, then you have a place or multiple options for you and your family to hide until things calm down. He rebuilt or built entire cities, including one called Sebasti. And in that city, he built another temple. And you're thinking, another Jewish temple, great. Well, no, not so much. This temple was built for 2 reasons: the worship of the emperor, Caesar Augustus, and the worship of the goddess Kor. She is the queen of the underworld. So he built a temple for the Jewish folks, but also built a temple for those who are worshiping the queen of the underworld. But his projects were, without question, hugely impressive. Herod also tried to cultivate an image as a faithful follower and adherent to Judaism, but his words and his actions made it clear his devotion was to himself and to Rome only. In addition to his relational messes, he also imported a bunch of new, what is called the mass entertainment things into Judea and Jerusalem that seriously offended the Jewish sensibilities. But really, the most famous example is this. Near the end of his life, Herod brought in and installed a massive golden eagle into the entrance to the Jewish temple complex. The golden eagle, of course, the symbol for Rome. And if you know anything about the Jewish people in the Old Testament, bringing any sort of icon or statue anywhere near the temple would have been absolutely unthinkable to those people. They were furious that he would think to do such a thing, to desecrate their holy place with something like that. So they made plans to tear it down, to get it out of the way. Herod caught wind of those plans. He found the traitors, and then to send a message, burn them alive publicly for everyone to see. You getting the gist yet? Not great. And finally, he wasn't just willing to sacrifice kids from Bethlehem to protect his power, but also his own sons. He had 2 sons to Miriam, Alexander and Aristobulus. They were part of that Hasmonean lineage, that previous regime, so therefore very popular among the Jewish people, and therefore very much a threat to Herod. His inner circle eventually convinced him, again with lies and false accusations, that his own 2 sons were planning to kill him in order to seize his throne. So what does Herod do? You'll be shocked. He has another sham trial in Sebasti, the city that he rebuilt. His sons are declared guilty, and he has them killed by strangulation. His own 2 sons. The conclusion of this incident led the emperor to say this: it's better to be Herod's pig than his son. Much safer. And that happened in 7 BC, not too long before the events of Jesus' birth. And friends, if you've already killed your own 2 sons to protect your power, a few dozen kids in Bethlehem, that's nothing. Nothing. So you might be saying, why would I ever want to choose Herod as king? Why would I ever want Herod's core values in my mind or to run my life? Well, I'll tell you why. At a surface level, it's actually really easy. Herod was a winner. Herod came out on top every single time. Herod embarrassed his enemies. He put them in their place. He kept them there, and Herod got things done. He got work accomplished. On the surface, it's easy to see why someone would applaud Herod, would want to say that, yes, that is the kind of kingdom values that I want instilled in me. But Herod is not the only king in the story we read today. There's another one. You may have heard of him. We're going to celebrate his birthday pretty soon. The second king is Jesus. So how does Jesus, in the story we just read, compare to Herod? Well, Jesus was an unplanned pregnancy born in a small town to parents of humble means and laid in a borrowed bed in the form of a manger. I don't know that it gets a lot more humble than that. That's a pretty humble origin story. I don't know about the totality of Herod's origin story. I'm guessing it's nothing quite like this. Jesus also had to suffer and adapt under the rule of the powerful and the cruel. We just read in the story that Joseph gets wind through an angelic visit that he needs to get out. And he's informed, you need to depart for Egypt to be safe, which is, think about this from a Jewish perspective. You need to escape to Egypt. Well, hang on, wasn't that long ago we escaped from Egypt? Now we're going back to Egypt? There was this little contingent of Jewish folks in Alexandria that had already left Judea in that area because of Herod, and so they joined them there. They were essentially political refugees in this small Jewish community in Alexandria made up of people that Herod pretty much just ejected from their own land. Jesus also grew up with a reputation that could be easily dismissed and easily ignored. Because we read in the story, in order to steer clear of Herod's son, even though Herod's dead, his son is now on the throne, Joseph relocates the family. He goes back to Nazareth when they get back from Egypt. Nazareth. Now, you and I read Nazareth, and it's like, okay, ancient city, doesn't mean anything. Actually, it means a lot. One of my favorite quips is from John chapter 1, when Philip and Nathanael are talking about Jesus. And Philip finds Nathanael, and he says, We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, the one the prophets wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nazareth. Can anything good come from there? I love the honesty. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Nathanael says. Why does he say that? There's a quote from Dr. Ray Pritchard. I've used it before. I'll use it again. I'm using it today because it's wonderful. He says, nothing much came from Nazareth, an obscure village tucked away in the hills of Galilee. We have lots of names for places like that. Backwoods, boondocks, Hicksville, illiterate, backwards, behind the times, dead end. And those are the nicer names. Every country, state, and province has a place like Nazareth. It's a place so remote that nothing ever happens there, no one of distinction lives there, and no one of importance comes from there. Jesus lived his entire life, up to at least his public ministry, with a reputation that could have been easily ignored or dismissed or set aside as somebody who came from Nazareth. And we don't just see this in Jesus. We see it throughout the story that God is telling. Keller makes this point. He says the whole world insists that if anybody has answers, those answers have to come from certain places. They have to come from people with certain credentials. And not only does God not operate like that, he habitually operates in the very opposite way. Over and over, God says, I will choose Nazareth, not Jerusalem. I will choose a girl nobody wants. I will choose a boy everybody has forgotten. Jesus is the pinnacle of this reality, but it's woven throughout the whole Bible. Think about just a few examples. Abel, not Cain. Isaac, not Ishmael. Jacob, not Esau. Older Sarah, not younger Hagar. Less attractive Leah, not more attractive Rachel. David, not his older brothers. Gideon, not a man from a powerful tribe or clan. And a long line of women who had been unable to conceive. Rebekah, Hannah, the mother of Samson, the mother of John the Baptist. And it continues through Jesus. When Jesus chooses his disciples, friends, by and large, he chooses the kind of people the world would have ignored and laughed at. And then God transforms the greatest enemy of the early church in the person of Saul to the greatest ambassador of the early church in the person of Paul. And Paul then later says, I want to toss aside all the right claims for the sake of Christ. God does this again and again and again. How does Jesus more widely compare to Herod? Well, let's talk about it. I'm going to go through these quickly, so if you can't write them all down fast and you're taking notes, I promise you'll get the slides later. But just compare these two kings, right? Jesus considered people and relationships as the most valuable things, never treating a single person as if they were disposable. Not once. Secondly, Jesus told the truth about himself and his intentions, even when it meant people would stop following him or even actively try to thwart his ministry. He told the truth all the time to everyone. I love that scene in the Gospels where he has the 12 and he's just finished doing some hard teaching and he's seeing they're just people leaving, people abandoned, people going away. And I think Jesus is grieved that people are saying, this teaching is too hard, I can't follow. And he looks at the 12 and he's like, guys, are you also leaving? Now, thankfully, Peter says, where would we go? You have the words of life. But still, Jesus told the truth so often and so loudly, and he didn't care if it meant people weren't willing to follow. Jesus also displayed anger on very rare occasions and never, ever for a moment acted from a place of rage. Not once. And Jesus never built a single structure to celebrate his legacy. Friends, he never even had an earthly home of his own to live in. Not only did he not build anything, he didn't have a home. He was also truly faithful to the heart of the Jewish law, and he called people toward faithfulness to God even above the legal traditions that they had piled on top of the law. But he was absolutely, truly, perfectly faithful to the ways of the Lord. And then lastly, Jesus never sacrificed anyone to eliminate threats or retain his power. Instead, he set aside his power. He sacrificed his own life to save us from the threat of our own sin. Can you see that it doesn't get more different than this? That the contrast couldn't be greater between these two kings? And you're saying, well, okay, yeah, we're all fans of Jesus. It's kind of why we're here. That's why we're excited about Christmas. But really, if you think about it, on the surface, Jesus looks like an absolute loser. Nobody knows his name for 30 years. He finally comes on the scene. Some people want to throw him off a cliff. He has a small group of friends. Even those friends abandon him at the end of his life. He ends up executed as a criminal under Roman law. On the surface, he's a loser. Why would we choose him as a king? Why would we choose his core values and his ways for our own lives? Well, because of this simple truth, my friends. It is through the person and ways of Jesus that God has chosen and still chooses to reconcile us to himself and transform his world. God didn't just choose the ways of Jesus during the life of Jesus, accomplish the resurrection, and then go, all right, now let's get about with the real business. No, Jesus reveals the fullness of the heart of God. That's what the kingdom of God looks like. That's how God reconciles us to himself and transforms his world. So what about you? Choose a king today. Now you're thinking, all right, pal, I don't need a king. Next summer, we're celebrating 250 proud years of having no kings. We left a monarchy. There are no kings. There's not even many functional monarchies left on the planet. Why are you asking me to choose a king? There's no throne anywhere nearby. Well, I have news for you. Yes, there is. Because each one of us has a throne built right into our hearts, and we have to choose a king. Tim Keller puts it this way beautifully. He says, in every heart, there's a little King Herod that wants to rule with total sovereignty. The impulse that says, no one tells me what to do. This dark episode of Herod's violent lust for power shows us one of the hidden truths of Christmas. It points to our natural resistance to the claims of God on our lives. Where's the true king? Well, that question is the most disturbing question possible to a human heart, since we want at all costs to remain on the throne of our own lives. Can I be honest? I read that passage several times, and I was a little offended. I said to Mr. Keller, how dare you, sir? How dare you suggest that I have a little King Herod in my heart? I'm not out here slaughtering children. But then I stopped and read it again and thought about it some more, and eventually came to the conclusion, he's right. I don't like it that he's right, but he's right. And it's a sense of scope. Herod controlled a pretty big kingdom. Mine's pretty small. But how am I operating within the little kingdom of my influence, my control? Whose core values am I choosing to shape the way I think, the way I speak, the way I act, the decisions that I make? Does it look more like that little King Herod that wants to stay on the throne of my heart? Or does it look more like King Jesus? And as far as reflections today, there's just one. It's a little longer, but there's just one. Which king will you choose? Which set of core values do you want to place on the throne of your heart? Do you want your life ruled by selfishness, fear, anger, suspicion, deception, and relational pragmatism, or by humility, kindness, gentleness, truth, integrity, faithfulness, and sacrifice? Because you and I get to choose our king. So take a moment, think, pray, reflect, read through that, whatever's helpful. We're going to have a moment of silence where I get to stop talking for a while, and we expect the Holy Spirit speaks to each one of us as we open our hearts. And then I'll pray in a moment, and we'll sing one more song together before we go. Our Father, we are so thankful today that you graciously give us a choice. You don't force a king upon us. You let us choose our king. And as much as we don't want to admit it, I'll speak for myself. I don't want to admit it. Yeah, there's a little King Herod in my heart. He wants to hold on to control and influence, wants to be protectionistic, that wants to gain instead of give. But Jesus, that's not what I want. I want you enthroned on the throne that's in my heart. I want your core values to be what shape the way that I speak and act, think and decide in the world. And whatever small little kingdom I have, whatever area of influence I have, Jesus, I want you to be installed as king. So God, we examine our hearts today and in the coming days, and as this Christmas season continues, as we approach Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, help us to remember that we get a choice, that we get to choose our king. We pray all this today in your name. Amen.